Thank you for taking the time to watch this video that will help you prepare for academic interviews. This will walk you through a variety of interview strategies and tips and serve as a starting point to maximize your success. Before we begin, we have additional resources and insights available in the interviews section of our website. For example, you can find downloadable PDFs of our guidebook chapters on interviewing, inside and outside of academia, and the bit.ly shown here will also take you directly to the academic interview guide. Big Interview is an excellent resource to prepare for different kinds of interviews, such as case interviews, technical interviews, etc., and can be accessed directly at nd.biginterview.com. While the specialized insights may not be for academic interviews, you can still utilize the opportunity to record yourself practicing your academic interviews in advance of the real thing. An interview is like a test, and you wouldn't go into an exam without having studied at least the night before. Similarly, the single most important thing you can do to increase your chances of success and reduce interview anxiety is to prepare by researching both yourself and the institution. Think of and write down all the experiences and skills you bring to the table. Were there unique classes you took? What have you taught? What challenges have you overcome in the lab or in the field? For the university that you're interviewing for, go to their website and look at their mission, their history, their department info. What backgrounds do their students have? Think of the status of higher education in general. What innovations in research and teaching have popped up recently? How are other schools doing? Who is thriving or closing their doors and why? How has the pandemic shaped the field or institution? Your goal during the interview will be to place the stories that you share about your background into the context of the university and the department you'll be working for so that they understand how you fit in. We'll talk more about what stories to prepare. All of the research that you do is designed to help your interview answers follow the 3 C's here. Your answers should be clear, concise, and confident. That's where your preparation comes in. The more familiar you are with your background and how it fits with the department, the easier it will be to give well-organized answers with confidence. If you're trying to remember the details of an experience on the spot, you will fumble around until you get there. A very common interview question is, tell me about yourself. Or in academia, perhaps they will start out with, tell me about your research. Despite how common it is, many people feel like this kitty here. Fortunately, there's an approach to make this easier. When discussing your research, here are a few key pieces to include. While it's easy to focus on what you did, don't forget to describe the relevance of your contribution to the existing knowledge or literature on the subject. Why was this project unique or important? Be sure that your energy and passion for the topic is contagious so the interviewers can see that you will be motivated to continue researching in the future. When talking about the next project, include enough details to show a well thought out plan. And finally, make sure any interviewers from outside of your specific discipline can also follow along. One way to practice that is by participating in the 3-minute thesis or 3MT competition. It's a great way to learn how to distill your research down to the essential elements included here and practice talking about it in 3 minutes to a non-specialized audience. Contact Graduate Career Services or the Graduate School for more details on 3MT. Before they dive into asking you about your research, they might say more generically, tell me about yourself. Or thanks for coming in today. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background? And if that's the case, there are a few ways that you want to consider structuring this particular answer. Keep this one a little bit shorter. It's just the trailer to the movie or the abstract to the article, so you should be able to deliver this answer in about 30 to 60 seconds. It can also be helpful to structure it with a little bit of a theme or a common thread rather than simply talking and listing the things that you've done chronologically or something like that. So that theme or common thread could be the type of structure that allows you to tie the pieces together, especially if you have either studied different things or had a variety of different experiences. It's important to connect your story to the job you're actually interviewing for. And you can start with covering some of these topics. Why did you end up at Notre Dame studying the topic you chose? Was there one particular interesting course that you either took or taught? What have you done out in your research, out in the field? And why are you interested in this particular position or this particular organization or university that you're interviewing for? So here's an example of what that can look like. As I reflect on my career up to this point, I'm struck by a pattern of curiosity. And then you would go on to show how that curiosity led you to study the current degree that you're pursuing, how it's been applied throughout your research, how it makes you better in the classroom, and then again, why it's leading you to apply for this particular role. As we look at the other types of interview questions you might be able to anticipate, a couple of general ones pop up. First is, what is your biggest strength? And this could be, what is your biggest strength as a teacher? What's your biggest strength as a researcher or scholar? Any number of things more specific, but it could also just be, what's your biggest strength? And it's important when you're asked a generic question like this to make sure that you include an example in your response. We'll talk a little bit later about what STAR stands for and how it can help you guide your stories. But basically, you want to pretend like they said, what's your biggest strength? And tell us about a time when you used it successfully. Make sure that you do choose a story that fits the role that you're interviewing for. So if you're interviewing for a more qualitative type of research role, you wouldn't necessarily want to spend the whole biggest strength answer talking about your quantitative research skills. The other side of that then is, what is your biggest weakness? Which again could be as an instructor or as a researcher or something like that. Unfortunately, most employers are starting to ask this more as, what is something that you're actively trying to improve rather than biggest weakness? But regardless of the specific question, they are trying to identify the process that you use in order to learn something new. So they're not trying to evaluate your weakness over someone else's in order to decide who's going to be worse at the job. It's just, what do you do when you're faced with something in your job and you need to learn something new? So the important thing here is to spend about 25% of your answer describing the area of growth, but then really focusing in on 75% of your answer describing 2 to 3 specific strategies that you're using to learn that new skill. So for example, you might say, something I'm working on this year is diversifying the ways I incorporate technology to engage students in person, building on the tools that came out during COVID. To develop my skills, I attended an EdTech conference this summer. I also bookmarked a wiki where other instructors share their ideas. And finally, I'm meeting every Friday for coffee with my department colleagues to discuss their tips and best practices. I feel that continuing these strategies will help me gain the skills I need to succeed moving forward. Now, it's also important that you do choose a weakness that's not centrally important to your role that you're interviewing for. So again, if it's a qualitative researcher position, you wouldn't necessarily want to focus on qualitative research skills as being something that you're looking for. And then also, it's important to focus on a deficient skill or maybe knowledge area, because those are easier to develop than trying to overcome maybe a personality trait or a bad habit, where anything you're doing is really just mitigating the negative impact of that particular trait or habit. So choose a skill, acknowledge it. They are looking for genuine self-reflection and introspection here, but then focus on what you're doing to get better in that area, because that's the transferable process that you'll use to improve and learn new things when you're on the job that you're interviewing for. Another kind of interview question is what we call behavioral interview questions, and typically start with, tell me about a time when, or give me an example of a time when. Employers are looking for very specific examples of things you've previously done that were successful, and we have a process you can follow to guide your answer. The first step is, if they say, tell me about a time when, tell them about the time. What was the situation you were in? What task were you facing? It's all background information, so if you prefer bar, give them background info, or car, give them context. We like STAR because it breaks it down to the bigger picture situation and then the more narrow task within that situation. Regardless, without this information, they won't understand the rest of your answer. The bulk of your response, though, should focus on your action. What steps did you take in that situation to be successful? Were there specific strategies or tools you employed? Did you have to collaborate with anyone? How did you engage other stakeholders? Finally, don't forget to include the results. Employers need to see that you had success. Now, if the only example you can come up with didn't work out the way you'd hoped, then say what you learned. You could follow that up with also adding how you have applied or would apply what you learned in the future. So here's an example of what that might look like. If asked, tell me about a time when you had to work with a difficult lab mate or a fellow graduate student, someone might say, in one of my rotations during my first year in the PhD program, I was working in a chemistry lab analyzing reactions of a particular enzyme. One of the other first-year students in the lab routinely failed to store his reagents properly, and I found out people thought I was the one causing the problem. Because there was both a safety issue at hand, as well as my reputation as an early-stage student in the department, I needed to address the situation. I spoke with my mentor for advice in confronting the student, and we developed a plan to approach the student away from the lab in order to prevent him from becoming defensive or causing a scene. I arranged to have coffee with him and asked him for his advice on the best way to store reagents in the lab, pretending not to know the answer. It turns out that he had never been trained on the procedure because he had been sick the day of the training and hadn't followed through on making it up. He didn't realize he was making a mistake. We were able to approach the lab manager to arrange his official training and to clear the air about what was happening. Both the lab manager and my classmate appreciated my approach in addressing the situation, and I was also able to influence how the training certifications are organized and monitored in order to prevent similar oversights in the future. Another scenario you might find yourself in is they could ask you about a situation you've never had experience doing. In that case, you have two options. You could offer to say what you would do, hypothetically, if it came up, or you could offer to talk about something related, but not quite the same. In both instances, the important aspect is to offer. Say, well, to be honest, I've never had the opportunity to do that before, but I have done something similar. Would you like to hear about that? Or, would you like to hear how I would handle that situation if it does come up? That way, the employer can move on if they really only care about specific things you've actually done. They might say, no, let's just, if you've never done that before, we can move on. Or, yeah, how would you approach that situation? But this way, you've basically given them first right of refusal, and you've helped manage their expectations around what it is you're actually going to be saying. Because you don't want them to be expecting to hear one thing, and then you say something else that ends up being different, and now they're wondering if you were paying attention or if you were really unsure of what they had asked. So by offering to go one way or the other, you can give them the opportunity to say, sure, go ahead, or no, let's just move on if you have never done that before. Much of interviewing is just storytelling, particularly when asked behavioral interview questions. You definitely can't prepare for every unique question they could ask, but if you prepare stories based on these topics that are of common interest to employers, then you can pull the one that fits with the whatever question you are asked. I chose the scroll image rather than a book for a reason too. As you prepare your stories before an interview, I encourage you to write them down so you have notes to study before every interview in the future, and you don't have to re-remember the things that you have done. It's pretty common, especially in the STEM fields, that you might be asked about your funding plans. There are two helpful elements to your answer. The first is to show that you have had success securing funding for your current or past research projects, particularly if that funding came from competitive or national awards rather than grant applications internal to Notre Dame. Second, you want to show that you will be able to secure funding in the future as well. And again, particularly focusing on the external entities that could support your particular projects and field. Unlike Pig here, we have all become pretty familiar the last few years with video conferencing tools like Zoom, Google Meet, or Microsoft Teams. So here are just a few reminders for video interviews. One is to make sure you have a plain background and nothing distracting behind you. And also make sure you are lit evenly from behind the camera. If you are sitting in front of a window or other backlighting, your face will be in shadow. Second, remember that if you want to make eye contact, you need to look at the camera. That way, when they look at your eyes on their screen, you'll be looking at them. When they talk and ask their questions, you can go back and forth from the camera to their face on your screen so you get some visual cues from their facial expressions. But anytime you want to make eye contact, look at the camera, not their face. Panel interviews are pretty common, whether it's the search committee or a group of students, and we get questions all the time about how to direct your answers and eye contact when talking to a panel in person. So if this person with the arrow were to ask the question, we recommend directing about 50% of your response to the person who asks the question and about 50% of your response to the rest of the panel. There are two options to achieve this balance. You could spend about, let's say, 6 seconds talking to the asker, and then 2 seconds each to the other panelists in order, and then back to the asker. Or you could talk to the asker, then to person 1, then back to the asker, then to person 2, then back to the asker, then to person 3, and so forth. Your goal is to keep everyone engaged while directing your answer to the person who asked it. Whether it's an upcoming mock interview event, a one-on-one session with your advisor or a graduate career consultant, through Big Interview or other forms, practicing your interview stories is essential for having smooth conversations during the real interview opportunities. Thank you for viewing our video on academic interview strategies. We hope you found it helpful and were able to take away at least a few new tips or ideas. We encourage you to check out our website for additional resources and information, and you are always welcome to schedule appointments through Handshake. Both in-person and virtual options are available. Best wishes for successful interviews.